Okay. So, basically what I wanted to do was look at the future of war. So we all kind of know that within humanity, wars generally tend to occur because people are greedy, and a lot of countries will start to try and fight for things for their self-righteousness and for other moral values that they think they're trying to sort of present. So it is possible that, yes, another world war might emerge, but it's not going to be like traditional wars that we've ever seen before where it's man-to-man combat. So let's kind of take a look at what happens and what the future of war is actually going to look like. So just to start off, I was just wondering for you guys, why do you think war arises? So I gave some ideas of why I think war arises, typically for greed, power, things like that. But what are your guys' thoughts, and why do you think or what other reasons do you think that war tends to emerge or arise, I guess? Yeah.
Fear.
Yeah. Do you want to expand on it, like in terms of what you mean by fear?
Fear of like someone else being more powerful than you are,
Mm-hmm.
and just always feeling the need to like be prepared if anything happens.
Yeah, for sure. I think like in terms of fear as well, you see this, for example, within Nazi Germany as well. There was kind of this fear that like, oh, like the Jews are going to come and take over, which is obviously a very irrational belief and not at all what reality is actually like. But this is kind of the sort of rhetoric that you see emerging and why countries and individuals tend to go for war. Does anyone have any other ideas? Okay, so what exactly does war kind of look like right now? So generally speaking, when we think of war, we see images like this, where you have soldiers actually on ground and in war zones. You tend to see a lot of famine and a lot of people sort of being displaced as a result of war and efforts that are taken by countries. And you see a lot of damage that's done to infrastructure, so you see buildings collapsing, you see entire cities pretty much being destroyed as a result of war and measures that are taken by countries. So what exactly is so problematic about war under status quo? So under status quo, what happens when you have war is you see a huge number of deaths, you see millions of people dying, you see ethical violations being taken, because what happens when you're in war zones is a lot of people tend to dehumanize their enemy. They see their enemy as just somebody that they need to kill to try and win something. So you see a lot of ethical violations like torture, like rape, and sort of just treating your enemy like an object. And then what ends up happening is that there's so many byproducts of war that are really negative. So things like famine, the destruction of social structures, whether that be political structures or economic structures, a lot of these end up being destroyed because of war. And then finally, you see a lot of displacements. So, for example, within the Iraq War, when the United States went in 2003, by the end of it, there was about 1.3 million Iraqi people who were displaced, who were taken from their homes, who were forced to go to other areas or seek refuge in other countries. There was the death of about 5,000 US soldiers. That's just the US soldiers. That's not even including the number of Iraqi people who died as a result of this war. And keep in mind, this war was only about 8 years, and it wasn't a worldwide conflict. It was simply between two countries. And you still see this type of death emerging. So essentially, the key takeaway is that this is really sad and this is really bad, because you end up having wars that take years to fight. You see so many deaths on both sides of the equation and so many people suffering. So what are some of the new emerging technologies? There's never going to be a time where war is necessarily going to be a good thing, and it should always be a last resort for countries to go to if nothing else works. But that being said, there's still mechanisms that can be taken to actually make war a little bit more ethical and to make it a bit more humane than what it actually is right now. So I'm going to explore 3 different areas. The first is going to be military robots. So let's take a look at how autonomous robots are kind of changing the game in the realm of war. So this photo is generally what people think of when they think of military robots. You think of a Terminator-like image, something that's entirely robotic. So this is just kind of like a little clip from the Terminator. But realistically, this is what military robots right now look like, is you actually have just robots. They don't necessarily look like Terminators. They don't look as threatening as they might seem to be. And what's actually fun is if you see that dancing soldier in the corner, if there was a military robot like this and that soldier was standing in front of it, it could actually be programmed to not like shoot at the soldier. So there's ways to program military robots to actually only target certain things and certain people and to actually save others, which is really cool, and I'm going to be showing you guys a little video of that just in the next slide. So there's 3 different categories of military robots right now. There's, generally speaking, remote-controlled weapons. So these are unmanned aerial vehicles that generally still need human confirmation. So this could be things like drones or stuff like that. You also have semi-autonomous robots, such as robot sentries. And a good example of this one is the Samsung SGR-A1. So this robot is actually in the DMV between North Korea and South Korea, and this robot actually patrols that area, and it's able to shoot an individual if they're found in that area. So under the status quo right now, the way that this works is a human has to actually give confirmation for that robot to shoot, but there is a function within it that this robot could shoot automatically, which is quite cool. But this is a semi-autonomous robot, so essentially it can still operate, but it requires human confirmation. And then this is an example of lethal autonomous robots. So I'm just kind of going to show you guys this video. Oh no. Shoot. Just see. Never mind. Okay, I will just flip it over so you guys can see, but it's a pretty cool video. So you'll kind of see how this robot is able to actually operate. So you guys kind of get the idea of what this robot is actually pretty much capable of. So it can function better than a human can if a human was put in these similar situations. So let's take a look at why exactly are autonomous military robots beneficial and why is this something that we're likely to see in the future. So humans generally have inherent weaknesses. So regardless of how strong you are, how morally just you think you are, or how ethical you might think you are still frail. So in comparison to a robot, if a human is put in a situation where they're getting punched, or if there's like a bunch of bees swarming them, or something like that, a human is generally more likely to kind of get scared, to get frustrated, and to become very, very fearful. So it's very probable that humans are likely to face these scenarios, but what ends up happening when you have robots is that you can actually program these inherent weaknesses out of them. And you can kind of get rid of those emotions of fear and frustration. And generally, when humans are in these positions, humans have a tendency to have a really difficult time incorporating beliefs or perspectives that don't necessarily coincide with their own. Whereas a robot, for example, doesn't necessarily think about those things. It's not programmed to think that way. So it's actually more flexible than a human would be, whereas a human is unable to change their opinions, a robot's able to be flexible towards that. There's also a humanitarian aspect to be made in a humanitarian argument. For example, I mentioned before that when you have wars, you do have a lot of things like rape and torture of victims on the other side, because humans tend to see the other side as simply enemies. So you actually get rid of that humanitarian aspect, you get rid of that ethical and emotional sort of understanding that humans have. So when you have a robot, you can actually program that in. You can get rid of like rape and torture and all of these things that tend to occur when you have humans in these scenarios, because humans are weak and humans make mistakes. And those mistakes can be really, really negative, whereas robots can be programmed to take those mistakes out pretty much. And then finally, just physical weaknesses. Humans generally, if you saw the robot could get hit and get up right away. A human, for example, if they got hit, they might not necessarily have that response time. It would take them a lot longer to kind of get up and get back into things, whereas the robot's able to do that really, really quickly. And you can, with these military robots, you can get rid of the byproducts of war, things like famine, things like rape and torture and all of those. You can essentially sort of get rid of all of those because of having these military robots. So there's a really good quote that I'd like to tell you guys about. So Peter Singer actually said that when a robot dies, you don't have to send a letter to their mother, which I think is a really good way to encompass why military robots are so beneficial, is because at the root, they save lives. So for example, if a human soldier dies, you have to sort of recognize the fact that they had a family and loved ones, and you have to go based off of that. Whereas if a robot dies, you can simply just get a new one. You don't need to send a letter to their mother or anything. There isn't really that connection. And then with robots as well, you can save lives on both sides, not necessarily just the soldiers, but people who are on the other side, the victims, and those individuals as well. And technology is advancing really, really quickly at this right now. So based on the Iraq War in 2003, when the United States went in, there was very little unmanned aerial vehicles, and there were basically no robotic systems on land. And by 2011, there were about 5,300 robotic systems on land, aerial vehicles, and about 12,000 land vehicles. So that just shows you the huge progression based on Moore's law. Within war and technology, it's really rapid and the increase is insane. So there are some ethical considerations that have to be made, particularly with military robots. So what happens when you have military robots is there's this potential that you might actually have the normalization of war. Since you're getting rid of the byproducts like famine and torture, you can actually maybe create a war in which it becomes normalized and the conditions of war become more tolerable for individuals, which obviously is problematic because we don't want war to become a normal activity. It should be something that's only done in the worst case scenario. So that's something that the international community is going to have to take part in, is making sure that war is not normalized and that people still recognize the gravity of it. There's this concept as well of distribution concerns. So with technology, with any introduction of technology, there's going to be this initial period where only the rich and powerful are going to have access to it, and poorer countries won't necessarily have that access. So when you're considering war, you do need to keep in mind with military robots that there will be distribution concerns initially. So it's just kind of with the ethical consideration that you need to make sure that it's not just going to be, for example, the United States or Russia or China having all of these military robots and everybody else suffering. There needs to be some level of distributing these products in a safer manner and in a way that's more ethical and fair. As well, there's going to be necessity for regulating how much countries can stockpile such weapons. So, for example, you don't want the United States to just have hundreds of these things just in the country that they can use at any point in time. You need to make sure that it's distributed ethically, or that there's caps on how many of these robots, for example, a country can have. And as well, just generally, when can autonomous military robots be used? Is this going to be for every single scenario? Or, for example, like, can you have it in peacekeeping and war times, or will it just only be in war times? Those regulations will need to be considered, and the ethical community will need to take part in these conversations. Secondly, let's look at cyber warfare. So I know that Sarah touched on a bit of the quantum supremacy stuff in her lecture on Tuesday, but I'm going to touch on it a little bit more. But yeah, so cyber warfare does exist already in a number of different ways, but there has been an evolution within it, and let's just take a look at how it's actually going to sort of rapidly increase within the next few years. So what actually makes cyber warfare so unique? It's painless and bloodless. There's no armed conflict. Nobody, like, you never have to have boots on the ground. This can literally be done. You could hack Chinese servers just from the United States. You don't have to actually go into those countries and actually do anything. So in a way, it is quite painless and bloodless. You can wage a war on someone without there being any negative externalities. You can pretty much have it be done in a way that it doesn't even look like a war occurred because there's no physical destruction in those countries. As well, these threats evolve very rapidly. So within a few hours, you could potentially just destroy a country's entire network. You could destroy so many economic and political systems within a country just within a matter of hours of actually having these threats evolve. There's also a high degree of anonymity. So, for example, the unique thing about cyber warfare is that it doesn't necessarily have to be state actors that participate in this. You can also have non-state actors. So the general idea that people think of is like, oh, someone in their basement is just hacking this entire network, which is quite possible. And because there's this high degree of anonymity when you're doing it online, it's really hard to target these back or to actually trace it back to who actually started these warfares and these threats, which can make it difficult to actually hold people responsible. And within cyber warfare, there isn't really any constraining political framework. So when countries go to war, there are measures and there are sort of treaties and laws that they have to abide by. Whereas for cyber warfare, since it is this relatively recent phenomenon that hasn't been developed entirely, there isn't really any constraining political framework that prevents certain things or holds people accountable as much. And then with the power distribution as well, it gives access to more individuals. So because if you have a computer and you know a little bit about computer science and how to do these things, you can pretty much be able to actually accomplish and create these threats. So it can be a little bit problematic as well because there is that power differential as well. So what are the key principles of cyber warfare and how does it actually tend to emerge? So vulnerability of the internet is a big one. The internet is quite global and vast that it's really, really hard to control what's on there and what really isn't. Additionally, you can't necessarily protect yourself from every attack because every single attack is slightly different. So they might follow similar frameworks and similar strategies, but there's still differences in each one, so it's difficult to actually create some sort of mechanism that prevents all of them at once. So you might get hit by one cyber threat and try and solve that, and then you might get hit by another one that's a little bit different and you don't know how to respond to that. So this kind of goes into the idea of the inadequacy of cyber defense, since a lot of people as well within society are a bit untrained to deal with these threats, so law enforcement doesn't necessarily always know how these threats evolve or emerge and how to respond to them. It can be really, really difficult to actually counter these threats and to ensure that they're contained. As well, there's just this plausible deniability since you don't necessarily know who created these threats and it's hard to trace them back. There is the potential that individuals will just deny the fact that they did them. We see this happening in a lot of political situations. For example, within the 2016 elections, you see allegations against Russia, and Russia just tried to say that no, we weren't involved in this. And because of the fact that it's difficult to trace it back, a lot of countries and a lot of actors can get away with this. Like I mentioned before, there's also the participation of non-state actors, so it doesn't necessarily have to be countries waging war against one another. It can also just be individuals or global entities like corporations and things like that. And as well, there's the international nature of the internet. Since the internet is so global and so diverse, you can have people from all over the world waging attacks on someone. It doesn't necessarily also just have to be one country doing the attack. It can be multiple actors working together to pretty much just shut down the United States, for example, or a larger country or something along those lines. So some of the common tactics of cyber warfare include espionage, propaganda, denial of service, data modification, and infrastructure manipulation. So most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but I'll predominantly go into denial of service since that's the one that's a little bit more different. This is essentially where countries or actors can deny the use of a computer to legitimate users. Basically, they flood it with really unnecessary information or data that isn't really useful, that kind of slows it down and prevents it from actually addressing the things that it needs to address. So there's two categories of cyber warfare. So first I'll talk about direct military threats. So these are generally directly targeting a country's ability to protect itself. And some of the examples I'll talk about, so China, for example, doesn't have a super duper strong military, but it's developed its cybersecurity and its cyberspace so much that it can now sort of be in par with the United States and be competitive in that lens. In 2007, there were denial of service attacks conducted by Russia on Georgia and Estonia that really shut down a lot of their systems. And this was done in the Syrian air defense as well. They hacked their computer networks right before a strike, which really prevented them from actually conducting that strike. And then in Iraq, in about 2007, I believe it was, Iraqi insurgents actually were able to hack into one of the US's unmanned aerial vehicles and be able to figure out how to access its video streams. So they were able to directly target their military and take advantage of that as well. The other category is indirect or non-military threats. So this is predominantly towards infrastructure, targeting a country's infrastructure and its other social or political systems. So some examples, one of them was an attack on Russian pipelines. This was done in Ronald Reagan's time. They targeted the Russian pipeline system in Siberia to basically make the computer software program go haywire and increase the pressure so much that these pipelines were unable to function, which really reduced Russia's ability to transport their oil from Siberia to other locations. And there was also done in the Stuxnet attacks in Iran. So it was done through the backdoor system of the IT systems, and basically they were able to shut down a lot of their nuclear power plants and uranium enrichment plants in Iran during these attacks. So how will quantum computing affect cyber warfare? So this is kind of going off of what Sarah talked about just a little bit about it. So we did learn about quantum supremacy and how that works. But currently the only way to decrypt information is testing out how each key works. That's done through conventional